Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Phillipson. I'm the Dean of the College of Law, and I'd like to acknowledge that we gather here on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. Before I do a very few short words of welcome, I'd like to ask Joseph Netauhau to come forward to provide a blessing and to perform an honor song in Ted's honor. Joseph.
Shy, so I'll stay over here. Okay, I have a song I wanted to use as an honor song and a prayer, and it's a very simple story, about Blackfoot and Cree conflict. So the song has the words in it, when the Cree one day met the Blackfoot. And the Blackfoot knew that the Cree were coming because they had a seer or a psychic, or gifted person who could see. So he said, go and meet the Crees. They're going to try and come and sneak up on us. We'll surprise them. And so they did. And so they started going after each other, like one by one. One of the Crees was anxious. He said, how did they know we were here? And so he just with his horse, rode towards the Blackfoot and just leaned back on the horse and tipped himself underneath the belly of the horse and shot an arrow and taunting them. Said, I could have killed you. And the Blackfoot, the same thing. Got on a horse and they came and they taunted the Crees, same way, underneath the belly with the bow and arrow. And nothing happened. Nobody got killed that day. They just played all day. And that's one of my favorite stories because nobody died. And I'm really glad that Ted Hughes and Craig here are advocates or bringing out this story about what I went through in residential school. And I don't know, it's like people are dying, but not as much. And this story is a really good story to be shared, with the world. Because I've been through it and it hasn't been easy, and it still isn't easy. I'm 64, but I can still sing, I can still pray, I can breathe, I can walk. I'm quite healthy, so I'm very fortunate to be standing here. And I'm filling in big shoes because Maria was supposed to be here, I guess, but she couldn't be here, Maria Campbell. But she's a good friend, so I'll try to do her justice. And this is a song here. So travel back in time and see the Cree and the Blackfoot. So the words mean that they came in their white ponies, but I still shouted my buffalo call. Very simple, just to mark the history of that time. And in the background you could hear a meadowlark, which I can't do very well, not as good as Winston Whitney, who gave me this story in the song. And then there was also a raven. So with that, I'll do an opening prayer. Mama, ohtaa maksiman tokaksi otsin. Ni aikautta piik. Kitsu kauimau. En näs mun te pisetus koukuta. Kamas neikit sekä nihtamas nää koma teuhi on näet se muun. Kinen näs mun. Ootana piu he pisetus kaat. Ted Hughes sekä sukuminda Craig. Ja kun nuumimas nää kamas neikan. Kauihta moitsik niin syitä ei sinuog. Tinikan kai piai maku muutti residential school kai seikaatik. Yksi minä näs mujan. Ei tuonna magian uutta. Magikta haka minun sisse. Situs katoak. Ei kaikki koikauan aikoja kama muuka matuak. So we ask blessings from the Creator that we continue to work together and make peace, make joy, live in harmony on our Mother Earth. Eikö se ole meistä magista magian? Bemat suunotse, että magihtoon, saagihtoon, ksiuatutatun. Eikö se ei tuon on, kun näskumt naaga, joka kohti nuakun magnak, niitsanak, nitsuamak. Hai. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Yes. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here to the College of Law and to welcome back Ted to the college. As Dean, you get to do some kind of grim things, you get to do some wonderful things, and events like this are wonderful where we get to honor one of our most distinguished alumnus. I don't want to say too much because we have a list of speakers who can speak more eloquently about TED than I can, but I just want to say that in my opening remarks to the first year class every year, I talk about the ethos of this college that I've been a faculty member here for 19 years and I was a graduate student here 28 years ago. So I've been around the college a fair bit, not as much as some of you, but around the college a fair bit. But I talked to the students in first year on the very first day in law school about the ethos of this college, and how it was transmitted to me was the lawyer as public servant. And you're here to learn skills which will help you be a public servant, to serve the public, to help people in times of need. And that is your mission as a lawyer, and we hopefully train you here with the skills you will need to be an effective and compassionate public servant. And all I will say about our honored guest is that I can't think of anybody who more embodies the lawyer as public servant than Ted Hughes, and I think the book is a clear testament to that. I wish every first-year student could read a copy of this book and see what it means to be lawyer as public servant, and the things that you do, and the things that you stand up for, and the things that you believe in. So it's a huge privilege as Dean to welcome back the epitome of the lawyer as public servant, Ted Hughes, to the college. And I also just want to say that a lot of people in this room have helped make sure that this book came to fruition. I won't single any of you out. I will just say that all of you, I might come and talk to you personally, I won't, but a lot of you in this room helped to make sure that this book happened, and we're deeply grateful. I know Ted and Craig are both deeply grateful for that. The one person I will single out is Dan Shapiro, who has been very instrumental in this, and I would like Dan to come forward and to introduce Ted. Thank you everyone for attending, and I'm delighted to welcome you all, and particularly Ted and Helen, to the college.
Thank you very much, Dean Phillipson. And I too wish to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 traditional lands and in the Métis heartland. And really, the indigenous character of these lands permeates the university and enriches all of our lives. I also want to thank Joseph Nataho for the beautiful opening and the song and the prayer and getting us going in the right direction. I thank you very much for being here. So many folks here, members of the judiciary, they're members of faculty, Dean Phillipson, Chancellor Romano, President Stoichev, and Catherine Warden, and so many friends, colleagues, donors, admirers of Ted and Helen Hughes. And I really want to welcome all of you today. They say that it takes a village to raise a child, and believe me, this baby required a lot of support, and it was from the folks in this room, and I really want to thank you for making this possible. It's a real delight and honor for me to be able to introduce the remarkable Ted Hughes. Before turning to that, though, I do want to thank some of the people for their contributions here. Craig McGinnis, the journalist turned biographer, did, I think, just a tremendous job in capturing all the forces that were instrumental in making Ted and Helen the remarkable couple that they are. And just, you could tell that there was a chemistry, although he retained his journalistic detachment, there was a chemistry between Craig and the Hughes family and Ted and Helen that was really quite remarkable, and you can sense that when you read the book. There's a small group of us that were involved in trying to move the project forward. Kathleen Keating, wave Kathleen, a colleague from Vancouver and a long-time colleague and friend of Ted's. Paul Fraser and John Waddell from British Columbia were all very involved in making this project come to life. The University of Saskatchewan played a really key role as we were trying to figure out how to arrange for the funding necessary to do a project of this size and do it well. And Acting Dean Beth Bilson stepped in and made the original applications for funding to the Law Foundations of Saskatchewan and British Columbia, without which this wouldn't have happened. And in terms of the Law Foundation of Saskatchewan, Merlis Belcher is here and played a key role in supporting the book. Catherine Ford was on the Law Foundation at the time. I don't know if I've missed any other Law Foundation reps here, but that was a big turning point, because after that, the Law Foundation of BC came on board, and then we were able to get a number of private donors, many of them among this crowd here, to help support the project. An unexpected spin-off of the project, quite a nice delight, was that in addition to supporting the project through the Law Foundation, Merlis Belcher had not only the inspiration but the generosity to start out a prize fund in honor of Ted and Helen. And it's been inaugurated, and it's called the Ted and Helen Hughes Prize for Excellence, Indigenous Children, Youth, and the Law. And beyond that, the Law Foundation generously has chosen to contribute its share of the royalties from the book to this scholarship, so it'll continue to grow. And the university, the College of Law, has done that as well. The other thing that's been quite a treat is working with the staff at the law school. Megan Cantwell, Heather Braun, and Katie Riley have just been incredibly capable and enthusiastic for the project, and it wouldn't have happened without their work. Dean Phillipson has been really instrumental in getting this event going and supporting it fully and enthusiastically. And of course, President Stoichev and Catherine Warden have been instrumental in embracing the project, making it part of the university's Canada 150 celebrations. And so it really is a number of people that need to be thanked and acknowledged. A special welcome to Ted and Helen's son Brian and his wife Liz, who made the trek from California, and son Keith and his wife Lori, who made the trek from Edmonton. So thank you very much for being here. Okay, I know I said I was going to introduce Ted, and I will, but there is another person that needs to be introduced, and that is Helen. And Helen has shared Ted's uncommon ability to target pressing problems and then to solve them. Really a remarkable person in her own right. She was a city councillor in Saskatoon, and then after moving to Victoria, spent decades supporting community organizations and programs that benefit children, youth, families, and First Nations. And after she served for the Ombudsman's Office in BC, the BC Council of Human Rights, and went on to win many elections in Victoria's City Council, repeatedly topping the polls. And reports are that her indefatigable campaign manager was Ted. And although Ted might take some credit for Helen's successes, clearly the voters recognized her many contributions on behalf of sexually exploited youth, lifelong learning, and her famous Super Bowl, that's SOUPER, of Hope fundraiser for the Victoria Youth Empowerment Society. So you can tell Helen and Ted are an extremely formidable team. Ted, I now come to you. I hope that's okay. But Ted was born in Saskatoon and studied at the U of S. He began practicing in 1952. He was appointed to District Court in 1962 and Court of Queen's Bench in 1974. I vividly recall, as a young lawyer in Saskatoon, appearing before Justice Hughes, and although I am confident that the courtroom experiences were not similarly memorable for him. Ted was inspired in his youth by both Tommy Douglas and John Diefenbaker. And a little-known fact about Ted is that John Diefenbaker appointed him to be an executor of his estate, which is an indication of the very high esteem in which Ted has held. When Ted stepped down from the bench in Saskatchewan in 1980, he moved to BC. Few would have guessed, some might have guessed he was headed for retirement. Ted had other plans. And before long, he became Deputy Attorney General of BC. Later, as BC's Conflict of Interest Commissioner, one of the first in Canada, he established principles that have guided his counterparts throughout Canada ever since. Ted is well known in Saskatchewan. He chaired a public inquiry into the shooting death of a Cree trapper in Saskatchewan, the LaChance Inquiry. And time again, Ted was called upon to head up an inquiry when public trust in our important institutions was in peril, very much in the tradition that Dean Phillipson spoke about. So whether it was the RCMP, prison services, or child protection services in BC and then Manitoba, he has played that role. In his late 80s, Ted presided over 92 days of public hearings. I think it was the first televised public inquiry in Canada, and produced an influential report. A Globe and Mail columnist wrote that Ted has earned a reputation as a scrupulously fair arbiter for all the tough political cases. Turning to Ted's work that is closest to my heart, he launched the government's ADR process, which was unique in the world, a process designed to compensate former students of residential schools who had been abused. Ted's leadership and commitment to justice for Indigenous peoples really set the tone that endures today in the successor independent assessment process, which is part of the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. But he built that process from scratch, and I remember stopping in at the Regina office at the end of the day after a hearing and finding Ted Hughes and Irene Fraser, who is also here from Edmonton. Irene, you better take a bow. And they were literally hidden behind piles of decisions to be reviewed so they could be released before the end of the week. And so although Ted is known for his public persona, I think about the private work ethic and the gracious good humor that inspire everyone who has been fortunate enough to have worked with him. Ted and Irene designed an adjudicator training program out of nothing and built a claimant-centered process in the unlikely headquarters of Regina. It always shocks and torments the political powers and bureaucrats in Ottawa to find out that our head office is in Regina, but it's been perfectly appropriate and made a big difference to the city of Regina and employment opportunities and work opportunities for many Indigenous staff that wouldn't have had that access to the federal civil service otherwise. But long before reconciliation became part of the parlance of Canada, Ted and Irene were determined that the ADR program would embody that very word, and they lived the term, reconciliation. They were determined that whatever the legal outcome of the case, former students would be treated with respect in an atmosphere of safety. But for more on Ted's career, you're just going to have to read the book. We have to keep a few things secret here for now. Those of us who have had the privilege of working with and learning from Ted have witnessed firsthand a remarkable person, a role model, and a mentor. In the words of Kathleen Keating, who has worked with Ted on many of his projects, Ted never forgets what is truly important, and he doesn't let the rest of us forget either. Ted?
Well, thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction. Most appreciated. And I want to thank everybody who's here today for coming out and taking part in this program. It's certainly an honor for Helen and for me to have the launch of this book take place here in my law school. I took my first classes in 1947, and it goes back that far. Most of the classmates of mine were veterans because our class came into law school in 1947, and they had returned, got their arts underway, and then moved over to the law school, and they were all just great people. There were 50 in our class, and I would say 41 or 42 were veterans. The school in those days was located in Quappel Hall, just at the north end that just looked over the bowl. And we had a dean and 3 other faculty members maximum. Dean Cronkite was the dean in my day, and Professor Ernie Whitmore, Bert Schmidt, and Charlie Bourne made up the complement of the law school faculty. But there were many downtown lecturers who came at 8:30 in the morning and did their lecturing before they went down to their offices downtown. I have had an association with nearly all of the deans of this law school. I had the good fortune to serve my articles in Moxon, Schmidt, Esty, and Robertson. And of course, Arthur Moxon was the first dean of this law school and was a good friend of our family. And he was a delightful man. I think he was first hired by President Murray as a classics professor in 1909, and went on ultimately to become the first dean of law. And as I said, the dean in my day was Dean Cronkite. The dean, like some of my kids, his kids got in a little scrape or two now and then, and when they needed a little attention at the city police court, Magistrate B.M. Wakeling presiding, the dean would phone me and ask me if I'd go down and represent the family. So I always felt that if I was able to straighten out things for the dean as his counselor for his family, I was happy to do so, and I must have got somewhere. Dean Cronkite was followed by Otto Lang, who had served his articles in our law firm before he came up to be an academic prior to his political career. So we had that association. And then Roger Carter was, of course, a good friend, neighbor, and Doug Schmeiser, who is here today, also both a good friend and a neighbor. And then there are others who, Dan Ish, who I will say something about in a few minutes, Peter McKinnon, who served on the Shantz inquiry with me up in Prince Albert. And then, of course, Beth Bilson, who has done a number of terms in the law school. Now, my real role to be here is to introduce the biographer, and I will get to that in just 2 or 3 minutes. Maybe it'll be 3 or 4. But I do want to just say 1 or 2 things. I consider that Craig McGuinness has done an outstanding job considering the subject matter he had to deal with. I wanted you to know that I was not the originator of the idea that there be a book. I had to be convinced, but I was ultimately, and the basis on which that was agreed upon would there be minimum or no interference on my part with what Craig wanted to write after he'd done all of his investigative work and had interviewed people. So the result is there. My thin skin is amply on display in the book with all of the warts that are grown on it. So it's there, and that's the way it is. Now let me just say that the book has 3 parts. The first deals with my 53 years in Saskatchewan, my family, childhood, educational, becoming a lawyer and a judge. You'll find a few laughs in the book. My neighbor at one point in time our neighbors were Ray and Gerda Natishan. I one night traced down what I thought was a break-and-enter artist who had rampaged the main floor of their home, followed this fellow in my car to the garage station at the Five Corners. You'll all know where that was. And then when he got in a taxi, he called. Delilah told the police, "Here's your man. He's now in that taxi. You follow and you'll have him." So they proceeded to do so. But I made the terrible mistake of agreeing to pick the fellow out of the police lineup. And I remembered afterwards that I never did ever see his face, and I picked the wrong guy. So the result was there was no case to go to court. That's one of the things that you'll get a laugh at. Another one, amongst those who were interviewed by Craig when he came out, was our now Chancellor, Roy Romano. And there's an account there of a case in front of me that Roy was a participant in. He had an accident in an intersection, and apparently I didn't agree that a Hollywood stop, as they called it in those days, was a sufficient stop. And that reference is made as he accepted the fact that that was the adjudication of the court. I also want to say about Chancellor Romano, and I've never had the chance to say this publicly, that the day after I stepped down from the bench, and within the last week of my being a resident of the province of Saskatchewan, he put through a special order in council naming me one of Her Majesty's Queen Counsel. And I greatly appreciate that. It sort of paved the way for me going into British Columbia. There was enough people in the Attorney General's ministry wondering who this guy was, and to have that a very generous move made by Attorney General Romano, as he then was, has always been very much appreciated by me. Now, I would just want to say this, that the book also recalls a very memorable day in court for me in Regina. It was a murder trial in the fall of 1974 with an Aboriginal chap charged with murder. And he obviously was very agitated, and I asked him if he would like to say something beyond what he was being asked to answer the questions by counsel. And he explained to me how foreign this court system was that he was caught up in. And if he had had his own culture and his own method with his own elders and people to deal with this matter, he wouldn't be in the kind of environment that he was completely unfamiliar with today. And it left a lasting impression on me to realize really what colonization had done to our First Nations people. And this isn't known, but I went home and said to Helen that there's going to be obviously great migration from the reserves into the urban centers of our country, and something's got to be done to build the bridges and to provide the opportunities for education, for recreation, and for health services. You get down there and run for city council, and you can do something effective. And she took my advice. I agreed to be the campaign manager, has been alluded to. And based on that, she ran for office and had a very successful run with what she called the Community Liaison Committee for 3 or 4 years, which really started to do what was intended by how I'd felt about that day in court. She went on to successfully receive the Order of Canada as a result of the work she had done there, and then went on, as had been alluded to, served for 18 years on the City Council in Victoria, working in the main with downtown youth and providing for them, and particularly the homeless. The impact of that experience in that Regina courtroom has been with me continuously since that day in 1974. That experience focused for me the negative effects of colonization on our First Nations population and made me a committed participant in what has now become known as the process of reconciliation. Part 2 of the book deals with my days in BC as Deputy Attorney General and Conflict of Interest Commissioner. As might well be known, I had a relationship that was a little rocky with one or more premier out there, but somehow we got through it. And when in that part of the book, you'll find the explanation for the title of the book. It wasn't my choice, but that was a title that was justifiably, I guess, hung on me by the press gallery in Regina, in Victoria. And hence, that's what the mighty Hughes appears on the title of the book. Part 3 of the book deals with my activities following my completion of my conflict of interest work, covering a period from 1999 until 2015. While I had many experiences, the one that I want to reference, and Dan Shapiro has talked about it, is the time from 2003 to 2008, the 5-year term, when I was the first chief adjudicator of Canada's Indian Residential School Settlement Program. The purpose of this program was compensation for the atrocities that had been committed in those schools. And the parties to the agreement, who I was honored to be selected by, were the Government of Canada, the survivors of attending the residential schools, the churches who ran them, and the consul who appeared on behalf of the claimants. Bob Imai is here today. He was one of those that was on the panel that I nervously appeared in front of out in Vancouver as I was interviewed for the position of chief adjudicator. I want to say, and her name has been mentioned, that here today is Irene Fraser. Irene, give us them a wave so they can see just who you are. That is the reason that the whole program was a success as it was. She was my right hand. We put through, during the 5 years we were there, something approaching 5,000 cases, and Irene and I, after the adjudicators had made their decision, before we sent them in for finalization, either Irene or I read every one of those decisions. So we know what went on in the residential schools, but I could not have had this, the program could never have been as successful as it has been without her participation. And I want to just say thank you publicly to Irene for what she did to make it a success. And I also wish to note that when I was through my time, the next person appointed chief adjudicator was Dan Ish, the one-time dean of this law school, who had been one of the adjudicators, and he served about 5 years as I did, and then came along Dan Shapiro. And this is a national program for settlement for as much as money can do for those atrocities that occurred. And the 3 participants who have all been named chief adjudicator are all graduates of this law school. And I think that that's very commendable in a national program like that, to have the 3 in turn all be graduates from here. This law school is continuing its involvement in Indigenous programs. The Native Law Center, of course, is now in its 45th year, launched by Professor Roger Carter, and has been mightily successful in getting the training done before the students entered the colleges of law across the country. Now that our college is participating in the Nunavut Law Program, and as of September of next year, there will be a compulsory first-year course on Aboriginal people in the law, which is in accordance with one of the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, I'm just about through, but I just want to say that there's been much going on in the educational world, and with the all the recommendations to be implemented from the Truth and Reconciliation, the United Nations Indigenous Charter, and all of those things are all going to bring ultimate relief and solutions to the problem. But my worry is about the short term, because I have continued my interest in dealing with child welfare matters, finishing that last report just 3 years ago in Manitoba. But the fact of the matter is that there has been little progress being made over the years in the high proportion of children taken into care from Indigenous families. About 60% of those in care are from Indigenous families, and that figure hasn't changed very much from when I reviewed the whole program in British Columbia in 2004, 2005. So therein, in my view, lies the challenge for us for the future. And that overrepresentation continues to be there with respect to prison population, suicide rates, overdose, and so on. So the real challenge lies, I think, ahead for us all to try to conquer that situation and do something in the short term while the long term works its way out. Now, having said that, I'm now going to get to the place where I was supposed to get to when I first came to the microphone, and that is to introduce the biographer. And let me tell you, it's been a real pleasure to work with Craig McGuinness. His first journalism experience was at Yellowknife where he was from 1974 to 1979, and he was a reporter, became the editor, and expanded the paper to 3 times a week from a weekly. He then did some time with the newspaper at the Windsor Star, and then went on to a long and distinguished career with the Globe and Mail, first as a copy editor, then as assistant national editor, in charge of the city desk, which was a part of the management team of the Globe. And he always, in his work, was dealing with, in the main, public policy issues, such as medical matters, the environment, and urban affairs. He became the Queen's Park bureau chief, and after some time of that serving there, he came out to Victoria, and from 1994 to 1998, he was the Globe's first editorial bureau representative in Victoria, reporting on politics and all aspects of BC life. And that continued to 1998, and that's where I sort of got to know Craig when I was as Deputy Attorney General and doing the other things around the press gallery, many of whom became my good friends there. And Craig then went on to the Vancouver Sun, where he was the legislative bureau chief from 1998 to 2003, and then an editorial writer and columnist for 10 years from 2003 to 2013. And since then, he's been a senior editorial consultant. And he's the one that those who decided there should be such a book as you have before you have tapped on the shoulder and asked him if he would be the biographer. And it's been a very, very happy relationship for me. I think he's done an outstanding job, and I'm going to ask Craig now if he'll come to the microphone and speak to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ted. Thank you very much for those kind words. As for the rest of you, I'm not quite sure what you're doing here still. In my experience as a reporter in the press covering Ted in the press gallery in Victoria, once Ted Hughes spoke, there wasn't much else to say. In fact, it was time to go home because the matter was settled. You know, as Dan said, there are many people to thank for getting this project off the ground, including Dan for his key role, Kathleen, who's here, and Paul Fraser, who first approached me, and Victoria, who I'm sorry couldn't be here. For all the support of all of you for the project, I'm very grateful. It was a great experience for me. But I'd also like to thank Ted and Helen. As a journalist covering the BC legislature, I thought of the mighty Hughes. I thought of Ted as the mighty Hughes for long before I was thinking about what to call the book. I won't go into the details of how the name came about. In fact, I'm a little bit disappointed in Ted in giving so much away. I'm glad that most of you have bought copies already. So although I'd followed Ted and Helen's respective careers as a reporter, I never had a chance to get to know them personally. And happily for me, it turns out that not only have they had incredible careers, they're both wonderful people and a joy to work with. I got to say something, though, about what we've been saying about Ted's hand as a political manager. He had great success, of course, as a manager for Helen, but that was in stark contrast to his own electoral success and the choice of a political party that he chose to affiliate himself with in Saskatchewan. And I'm very happy that despite my West Coast bias, we were able to launch the book here in Saskatoon. You know, you heard earlier from Dan about Ted's many contributions to Canada in his long career, and that really did all start here. You know, he grew up across the river in a house his parents built on 9th Avenue. It still stands today. And for those of you, any of you who still have adult children living in your basement, Ted lived at home with his parents till all the way through law school, and part of the time he was articling. So, and he turned out all right, so you don't have to worry. I was going to read a little bit more about what life was like here in the law school for Ted, because this place is a lot different now than it was in 1947, 70 years ago, 70 years ago. Ted started law school here, and he would still, I think, be one of the brighter students today. And so university meant a change of venue more than a way of life. Ted still lived at home. He walked to the University of Saskatchewan, down to the end of the street and across the frozen South Saskatchewan River in the winter, and farther along to the 25th Street Bridge in the spring and fall. The tall, thin freshman with an eager smile fell easily into the academic life, attending classes in the distinctive buildings of locally quarried graystone spread around the large campus. Ted describes himself as an unexceptional student. He failed French one year and had to go to summer school. Fortunately, in the years following the war, the threshold for getting into law school was fairly low. Says Ted, if you had 2 years of the arts, you showed up and you enrolled and you went in. In retrospect, Ted says that many of his classmates who wouldn't make the grade to get into law school today went on to become fine lawyers and judges. What they lacked in academic prowess or background, they more than compensated for in life experience. And Ted talked to you about the nature of his classmates, and I think the other thing worth mentioning was that Ted was in a class of 50, 49 of whom were men, and 1 was a woman. Ted got quickly into debating and politics. He was drawn to the Progressive Conservative Party. As Dan said, he admired both Diefenbaker and Tommy Douglas, but it was Diefenbaker that he took after. And he became one of the top debaters. In 1949, he and his partner, fellow law student Hal Sissons, defeated a team from the University of Saskatchewan College of Education to win the Hill Cup, a symbol of inter-college supremacy. Hughes and Sissons argued in favor of the proposition, resolved that science has hindered the progress of Christianity. The Saskatoon Star Phoenix of February 3, 1949, reported on the competition, noting Hughes argued that science had obliterated 200 years of Christian missionary work in Japan with the atomic bomb. It was noted that Ted did his articles with the prominent firm of Moxon, Schmidt, Esty, and Robertson. When he was finished, the bright, energetic young lawyer got a glowing letter of reference, but no job at Moxon, Schmidt or any other firm in Saskatoon. The law business was hardly booming in the decade after the war. In fact, many of the older lawyers bridled at the notion that they were running a business at all. Most of the commercial business in the province was in Regina, and many lawyers in Saskatoon were on their own and barely had enough paying clients to keep their doors open. Only a few firms had more than a couple lawyers, and many worked in antiquated offices with little or no staff. Hughes never seriously considered going out on his own. He had no money for a law library, and as he would later discover, not much of an appetite for the business end of law. But he did consider going to work for the growing oil industry. He applied for a job with the Albercan Oil Corporation in Calgary. When the company offered him a position starting at $250 a month, he turned it down. He wanted to stay in Saskatoon. In July 1951, he took a position paying $200 a month in North Battleford with a more entrepreneurial-minded lawyer who was looking for a young associate. Ariel Sallows was a prominent local solicitor who also owned the only funeral parlor in town, a business he inherited from his father. Says Ted, every morning when he came into the office, you would hear him dial a number and say, "How many?" Sallows expected Ted to go out and find work. One source was fowl suppers, which were community events held in church halls in the towns around North Battleford. Sallows told him, "I'll get you the calendar, and I expect you to be at every one of those fowl suppers. That's where you meet the farmers. I want you there, and I'll be at some of them." So that fall, says Ted, I made the rounds to several fowl suppers, and I really did enjoy meeting the farm community. Like other lawyers in Saskatchewan at the time, Hughes took on whatever came along. He says there was absolutely no specialization because everybody was anxious to do everything to earn a living. The work he found was mainly conveyancing and wills. Crop share agreements, leases were very common, where a farm property would be leased on the basis of not so many dollars for the year, but a share of the crop. Generally, 1/3 went to the owner of the land and 2/3 to the renter, who had to bear all the expenses for putting in and reaping the crop. If it was a good year, he says, the landlord did very well. If there was a drought, then the landlord suffered along with the tenant. So it was a different business back then, and Ted eventually made it back to Saskatoon, where he was anxious to get to because Helen was here. And weekends he would hitchhike back and visit and then go back there. And I'm going to cut this all short because we've gone through a lot of it. But as Dan said in 1962, with the help of his contacts in the Progressive Conservative Party and no small measure of competence, Ted became a district court judge at the age of 35. And one of the things about practicing law at the time and being a judge is you did a lot of driving. And as many of you know, Ted and Helen drove here this week from Victoria. I flew. He liked to drive, and he was often in a hurry. Says Ted, I had a few tickets. I recall one. A jury had come in on a murder trial in Moose Jaw. They came in about 10 in the evening. I had to get packed up and leave for Saskatoon. I was roaring up the highway at, I guess, 80 miles an hour, or perhaps a little more, at 1:30 in the morning, and the red cherry came on behind me. The police officer recognized me. It was awkward for both of us. After being told I was speeding, I asked, "Did you stop me to give me a ticket?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I'll wait while you write it out." No way was I going to have some policeman saying, "Those damn judges get a break." On another occasion, I got a ticket coming in from Bigger, Saskatchewan. I don't know why, but it had to be settled out there. So I had Helen go out to Bigger. On this day, the ticket was returnable, and the headline of the Bigger Independent was, "Judge's wife pleads guilty to judge's speeding ticket." Through all the miles and all conditions, he never had an accident in Saskatchewan, and he brought his blasé prairie outlook on snow to Victoria, a city where the word blizzard is usually associated with falling cherry blossoms. Says Ted, "When I was Deputy Attorney General, I got a phone call about 2:30 in the afternoon. I don't know who was calling, but it was someone in the ministry who said, 'Are we closing early today?' And I said, 'Why would we close early?' And they said there was a storm warning out, and there's going to be a storm warning, a snowstorm. And some of the other ministries' deputies had given their staff permission to go home. I looked out the window and the snowflakes were beginning to come down, and I said, 'No, we're not closing today. There's a storm, but it won't keep anybody from getting home at the end of the day, as far as I can see. And we're carrying on with our work as usual. Thanks very much.' I always remember that. On the prairies, you worked your full day and went home, whether it snowed or not. I don't remember who called me, but I always remember sitting there where I was when I got that call, and I thought, 'Holy Lord, not a chance are we shutting down.' Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the book."
Thank you, Craig. And now I'd like to ask Chancellor Roy Romano to come forward with some words of thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Phillipson, Mr. and Mrs. Hughes, and distinguished guests, President Stoichev, and Catherine Warden, and friends. Reminds me of the time which happened to me quite often when I was in political life, an introduction which started out like this: "Ladies and gentlemen," we weren't politically correct in the early days. "Thanks to the women, who made a wonderful dinner for us. Thanks to Charlie on the old-time country fiddle for playing some good music. Now that all the good things are over, here's our guest speaker, Roy Romano." And I feel after the talk given to us by our special guest of honor, Ted Hughes, all the good things really are over. We are here to celebrate the book, of course, The Mighty Hughes, by Craig. I was interviewed by Craig, and it's a terrific book. And I especially want to thank and acknowledge Ted Hughes and his partner, Helen, for being here today. My first question was, who really is of the pair, the Mighty Hughes? Both make a tremendous team and have made a tremendous contribution, not only to Saskatoon and Saskatchewan, but to all of Canada and beyond. This book and its launch gives us precious opportunity to express our thanks and our respect, Ted and Helen, Ted, to their great contribution to Canada and Saskatchewan. From the very start of his legal career in the 1950s, as has been told very humorously and very graphically, Ted has established a sterling reputation for integrity and an expansive knowledge of the law and common sense in the application of the law. It was actually a Hollywood stop, Judge Hughes. I'll have to talk to you about that a little later. But as a judge, he became known as a jurist with a deep understanding, not just of the practice of law, as important as that is, but also the fundamental principles of justice and truth and the importance of them in our democratic society. In 1980, we lost Justice Hughes and his huge ability and his integrity. If I may say so somewhat immodestly, as Attorney General at that time, I tried my doggonedest to convince him to stay, but for a whole number of reasons, he embarked upon a new career and an illustrious career that was to have had tremendous wide impact throughout all of Canada. He had distinguished public service in British Columbia, as has been described, topping it off by serving as Deputy Attorney General of that province, and I know something about the importance of that role. In 1990, became BC's Conflict of Interest Commissioner and produced a number of nationwide precedent-setting decisions on conflicts of interest and reports. I know a little bit about that firsthand, all too well. When Saskatchewan's Conflict of Interest Commissioner was reviewing the premier's, at that time, free honorary membership to the golf course called Riverside here in Saskatoon, which I had one of those honorary memberships. I had felt the long reach, even after all those years, of Ted Hughes and his precedent in BC that ruled that such an honorary gift violated the conflicts of interest provisions in British Columbia. So much for my golfing career at Riverside. Later, Ted Hughes' reputation as an impartial arbiter led to his appointment to chair numerous inquiries into sensitive and difficult issues in a number of jurisdictions. Too numerous to discuss. You have to read the mighty Hughes. There's one I think that I should refer to. He was one of the 3 graduates of this College of Law, as has been said by a number of others, the other 2 being Dan Ish and Dan Shapiro, who became the chief adjudicator in the Indian residential schools dispute process, an extremely important matter of justice and public policy to today. This work respecting the compensation settlement intended to provide some financial redress as small recognition for the physical, emotional, and cultural injuries suffered by the survivors of residential schools, and was a vitally important companion piece of work to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission overall. Friends, I could go on, but as you can see, Ted Hughes has dedicated his entire life with intelligence and integrity and brilliance to the pursuit of justice and the betterment of our communities. This has resulted in what can only be described as an enormous contribution to Canada. And it is my privilege and honor, on behalf of our president, on behalf of all of the community of the University of Saskatchewan, to thank him for this outstanding contribution. Ted Hughes, you are truly a mighty Hughes and one of Canada's greatest Canadians. Thank you for all that you've done and many more years. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the program here at the College of Law. Again, I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and it's been my pleasure to host you here, and please feel to come back anytime. Any alumni always welcome here. And thanks again in particular to Ted and Helen for traveling to be with us today and sharing this experience. Thank you very much.